You're listening to Economics Detective Radio. My guest today is Steve Horwitz. He is the Charles A. Dana Professor and Chair of the Economics Department at St. Lawrence University. Steve, welcome to Economics Detective Radio.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
So Steve recently wrote an article titled, "Make Babies and Don't Let the Greens Guilt Trip You About It." This was a response to an argument made by the bioethicist Travis Rieder, or Rieder? I'm not sure about the pronunciation. I'll go with Rieder, who he was profiled by an NPR piece. So Rieder argues that it is immoral to have children because the burden of additional humans on the planet is so large, and in particular, it contributes to the catastrophic risk of climate change. He also argues that these children won't have very good lives because catastrophic climate change will be happening within their lifetimes. So here's a quote from the article where they're describing a lecture that Rieder is giving. Quote, "Back at James Madison University, Travis Rieder explains a PowerPoint graph that seems to offer hope. Bring down global fertility by just half a child per woman, and this could be the thing that saves us," he says. He cites a study from 2010 that looked at the impact of demographic change on global carbon emissions. It found that slowing population growth could eliminate 1/5 to 1/4 of all the carbon emissions that need to be cut by mid-century to avoid that potentially catastrophic tipping point, end quote. So my question to you, Steve, is what is Rieder missing in this argument?
Well, I think the fundamental thing that he's missing and many Greens, radical environmentalists miss when they talk about population growth and those issues is the fact that human beings are not just consumers of resources, users of carbon, or however we want to think about it. We aren't just our carbon footprint. In fact, we're producers, right? We, when human beings are born and make it to adulthood, we're able to contribute to the division of labor. We're able to come up with new ideas. We're able to produce things with our minds and our hands that haven't been produced before and enable other people to produce things that haven't been produced before. So it's not, and that production, of course, enables human beings to use existing resources more efficiently. So if we were, in a way, just like animals and sort of, reproduced at will, right, what would thin us out would be the fact that there weren't enough resources to enable us all to survive. And that's the crude version of Malthus that I think people in the radical Greens work with. But the reality is that we as human beings are able to create more resources for ourselves. More people enables us to do that more effectively by using resources more efficiently, developing new technologies, again, more fine division of labor, more productive. So it's not just that we kind of go around eating resources. We actually create more, most human beings, at least in the right social institutions, create more resources than they use up.
Okay, when we talk about creating resources, we're not talking about any kind of violation of thermodynamics here.
Right. That's an actually really important point, okay? Because economic activity can't, the number of atoms in the universe or on the planet, right, is we can't change that, okay? But what economic activity can do is to rearrange those in ways that deliver more value to people, right? So all in some way, all we mean by economic growth and by having more resources to use is that we're taking those atoms and rearranging them in ways that create more value, that enable more people to survive, longer and live longer and better lives.
So, for instance, if you were a farmer 500 years ago and you struck oil on your land, you'd go, "Oh no, my land is ruined."
Right, and that's not even a hypothetical, right? I mean, oil was a nuisance until the late 19th century when we figured out what to do with it, right? So, and of course, since then, we've figured out ways to use it more efficiently, and to find more of it. Just to stay with this example, the quantity of proven oil reserves today is much greater than it was 25, 50, or 100 years ago, even though we've used up billions and billions of barrels of oil for a variety of reasons. One is the fact that we've used so many means it's in demand, it has value, people will spend more resources in finding that oil, and the fact that it has a price attached to it and creates an incentive to do that. So yeah, I mean, we are able to create resources. Another good example of that is until, the kind of digital revolution, sand, the economic value of sand what was not obvious. But in a world of fiber optics and all these sorts of things, right, we're basically making these things, fiber optic cables and so on out of what equivalent of sand, right? And for a while in the 60s, people were very concerned that we were going to run out of copper because of all the new phones, phone lines and so on that would need it. But that encouraged people to look for substitutes. People developed fiber optics, and that's not a problem anymore. So, this is the sort of thing we're talking about, that human beings are able to develop new uses and new ways of using resources that enable us to survive and more people to survive.
So it sounds like there's a trade-off then between the things that people produce and I guess their carbon footprint. And a lot of this comes down to our estimate of the social cost of carbon. So Rieder sees this cost as being so high that it would outstrip all other concerns. And, he expects apocalyptic changes in the Earth's climate within, I think the date he gives is only like 2036, so 20 years out. Now, economists are not climate scientists, and we aren't trained to perform our own studies on the relationship between carbon emissions and global climate. But what we can do is look at the bulk of the published research. The two things we could say about this to someone like Rieder are, first, that he seems to have based his arguments on the absolute highest estimates of the climate impact of carbon, where, a reasonable person might just look at the median estimate. And second, people who have performed meta-analyses of this literature have seemed to find evidence of publication bias towards finding a larger impact, meaning that, maybe as an outsider, you might look at this literature and then your most reasonable guess would be that the median estimate is even a little high. So if the kind of climate change Rieder sees coming in 20 years is really more like 200 years away, it changes the argument a lot. Is there anything you'd add to that?
Yeah, I think that's a bunch of good points. I think the one thing I would add is so when we look backwards, the history of worst case predictions on climate change have been almost completely and utterly wrong, right? I mean, I've often joked about giving out a Paul Ehrlich Award for the worst prediction in the social and natural sciences, because Ehrlich was so frequently wrong all the time about these kinds of scenarios, right? And so I think there's good, as you say, there's good sort of logical, theoretical reasons to say extreme predictions aren't likely. But I think history tells us that they just simply haven't come to pass. And I think the other point I'd just add is when we start thinking 200 years out instead of 20, what economists would point out is then we have to engage in present discounted value, right? That the cost, if the costs are 200 years out, those costs are lower to people alive today than they would be if they're 20 years out, right? Paying a cost more, in the near future is a greater cost. And that, whether it's 100 or 200 years, gives us the time needed to continue to use the market process and these incentives we were just talking about to develop substitutes and so on, right? People in the 60s were worried about running out of copper. We've constantly been worried about running out of oil. Yet what happens? We end up using more and more and finding more and more at the same time and starting to develop real cost-efficient substitutes for oil, which is great. I'm all in favor of that. That's part of, it's driven by the market. That's an important part of the process of how human beings use resources.
Yeah, you mentioned discounting the future. There's multiple aspects to that. There's the subjective discount, which an environmentalist might argue, well, we should put equal weight on future humans and present humans, and that should be zero. But there's other elements to that too, are there not?
Yeah, I mean, once we start talking about costs, as you said earlier, we're talking about trade-offs, right? So what are we, if the costs are 200 years away, what are we willing to give up today to prevent those from happening? People are simply going to answer differently than they would if it's 20 years away, and rightfully so, precisely because that time frame gives us the opportunity to engage in activities that hopefully will reduce and ideally eliminate those costs when they actually come around. So to sort of say it's no different to talk about 20 years or 200 years, it not only ignores the sort of human reality that we treat costs differently when they're at different points in time, but ignores the fact that we should treat them differently because that gives us the time to make those changes.
Right. So for instance, if we expended a large cost now to reduce our output of carbon, we'd have to sacrifice other projects. And those other projects also, they have a value to us now, but they might contribute to growth and have a value to the people 200 years out. So
exactly.
Yeah.
So again, if you want to do cost-benefit analysis, you have to do cost benefit analysis. And if you want to talk about costs, the first thing economist says is you have to talk about opportunity costs. So as you just said, Garrett, the kinds of things, what if we spend money fighting global warming and climate change now, what are we giving up to do that? And is it worth it? I think this question, the is it worth it question, is a really important one. When I teach intro to econ and I spend a whole week on sort of environmental and related issues, and one of the things I try to get across to my students is the optimal quantity of pollution isn't zero. And what I mean by that is if we decided, if everyone agreed that we wanted to get pollution down to zero today, the question is, what would we have to give up to do that? And people might decide that the value of the things that we'd have to give up to do that are greater than the costs imposed by the pollution, right? So we live with a certain amount of pollution simply because the things we'd have to give up to reduce that pollution any further are too great. Same way, we could reduce the number of highway automobile accidents, much farther down if we made the speed limit on interstate freeways 40 miles an hour, right? But nobody wants to do that because we think the costs of that are greater than the benefits we get in the reduction of death. So we already believe in other areas that the optimal quantity of something bad isn't zero. We're willing to tolerate certain kinds of risks and costs because the alternatives are worse. And I think that's part of the argument that economists frequently make about the issues we're talking about is we have to recognize that there's trade-offs, as you said, everywhere. And that we can't magically wave a wand and make bad things disappear. Getting bad things to go away means giving up good things.
You mentioned Paul Ehrlich earlier, and I think the figure who we should talk about is, of course, Julian Simon. The two of them had a famous bet. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, kind of where to start. Julian Simon was not an economist by training. He did demography and other kinds of things, but he understood the economics of population and resources and wrote a wonderful book called The Ultimate Resource, and there was a revised edition, The Ultimate Resource 2, that laid out all the empirical facts about how we're not running out of resources, population growth isn't necessarily bad, and so on. So in 1980, he offered a bet, and the bet was pick a market basket of sort of precious minerals and resources and so on, and the bet was figure out what the value of that was in 1980, and then Simon was willing to bet that the prices of those goods would be lower in 1990, which would indicate that the goods were less scarce, not more scarce, and that anyone who was willing to take the bet on the other side, right, they'd agree that one would pay the other the difference in the value of that basket of stuff. And of course, Ehrlich took the bet, being convinced that we're running out of all this kind of stuff. And when 1990 rolled around, something like all but 2 or 3 of them had become cheaper, were more abundant, and Simon won the bet, and Ehrlich had to write him a check. And then Simon offered another 10-year version of the bet from 1990 to 2000. I think this time it was just straight up $10,000. Nobody took it. And of course, Simon died way too young in 1995, I believe. So that never was finished. And I should note, by the way, right? I respect Paul Ehrlich in 1980 for putting his money where his mouth was. But let's note, he was spectacularly wrong. So the empirics suggest that the sort of Julian Simon type position and the kind of position I've been outlining here have some empirical support, have historical support.
Yeah, and it's really important that, Ehrlich got to pick what bundle of things that he was going to bet on, right? So
right, I believe that's right, yeah.
Yeah, so Simon was making this very bold, very open-ended prediction that just in general resources get less scarce, not more. Although I've heard it pointed out that if the bet had been made in there are some decades where the bet could have gone the other way, but pretty generally it's still with Simon.
Yeah, and again, one of the couple different things, right? One of the challenges here, and I think Simon is right to say, life's getting better, resources are getting more abundant, and so on. I think that's right in general. The problem is that, what we really probably should be saying is when people are sufficiently free, and markets are sufficiently functioning, right, that's what happens. Under full-fledged socialism, you would not see this progress happen, right? And so it's always tricky to sort of separate out what we might think of as the sort of long-run upward trend of humanity from short-run trends that might be affected by bad policy and the like.
Yeah, so or just, if you made that bet and oil was in the bundle and then you had, the Iranian Revolution happened right at the end of it, then of course, that's part of more, cyclical political things, not the broad sweep of history.
Right, exactly. I think that's exactly the distinction that you want to make here. And what's cool is that even given all that short-run stupidity that people engage in, it's still the case that as Simon's evidence and others have pointed out, Ron Bailey is another person who writes for the science editor of Reason magazine. Ron does really good stuff on this now too, as does the economist Don Boudreaux, sort of pointing out that life's never been better in all these ways, despite the stupidity and craziness.
So, as you say in the article, human progress depends upon the increasing productivity that comes from a finer division of labor and new ways of doing things, and those are the result of more people. So this argument goes back to Adam Smith. The division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. So could you explain more what you and Smith mean by division of labor and a finer division of labor?
It's every young economist's dream to hear the sentence that says, can you explain what you and Adam Smith mean by anything? So yeah, the idea here is there's two notions of the division of labor. Sometimes we think about like within a factory, right? And sort of, I'm the guy that puts the rearview mirrors on the Chevys, right? But the sort of more important division of labor is what I think of as specialization, right? That each of us specializes in one kind of thing that we produce, right? I don't make my own clothes or my own food. I produce, economics services, and people pay me for that, and then I use that to buy things from everybody else. And so the more finely, the more precisely, the more narrowly, right, that we can divide up labor, the more narrowly we can specialize, the better we will become at doing those things, right? Specialists are more productive. And as we do that, we collectively get more productive, and people who specialize obviously produce way more than they themselves need. I don't need to hear my own economics lectures, so I sell them to other people, if you want to think of it that way. A farmer who's gotten very good at producing corn, a particular kind of corn even, right? Doesn't eat it all, sells it. So we specialize and we trade with other people. And the more precisely we specialize, the more finely, the more narrowly, the more precisely we divide up labor, the more productive we can be, the more excess we have to trade with other people, the richer everybody is. The idea of the extent of the market, though, is that we can only specialize as narrowly as there is a market to support buyers to buy that particular precise thing, right? So my favorite example is I lived 27 years in a very small town in New York State, and there's no Ethiopian restaurant, right? There's no, Afghani restaurant. There's no Northern Italian restaurant, right? And in general, the restaurants tend to have very broad menus to appeal to lots of people. Go to a big city, like I'm, in Indianapolis now, and you can find these very specialized cuisine and restaurants with very narrow, precise, menus, because there's enough people who want that very narrow thing to support it. So one of the signs of progress, one of the ways we progress is as we have more people are interested in these things, we can more finely divide up labor. That makes us more productive, right? So we're able to produce the kinds of things that people want, get more specialized trade. We see progress happen that way. And certainly when we get to a certain point, that progress enables us to really start reducing the transaction costs involved in trade. It's easier to find trading partners and easier to find the things we want. You can think of what the internet and smartphones have done in recent years, and that pushes progress even farther. We can divide up labor more finely. We can more precisely tune our behavior to what other people want. So that's the key process. That's the process of growth right there. And it's part of Smith's genius that he identified it 240 years ago.
I can confirm that Vancouver does have an Ethiopian restaurant, maybe
right.
more than one.
Right. Yeah, Vancouver's a great great example. It's one of my favorite food cities in the world, actually. But, you can find, especially sort of, Asian and seafood kinds of things in Vancouver, very precise sorts of, markets for things. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I can confirm I could get in my car right now and drive for 10 minutes and get to a place where every sign is in Korean and they serve, multiple different kinds of Korean restaurants. So, yeah, exactly. I mean, and you can really see how a very small place would not be able to support that kind of diversity. One example I really like of this, Matt Ridley, in his The Rational Optimist, he gave an example of this going in reverse. I think it was Easter Island, where they showed up and they had more advanced tools, and but as their society shrunk, they got more primitive.
Well, right. And another example of this is the United States during World War II, right? As we used resources for the war, the resources available for people at home were fewer, and there were fewer people because we were sending, men off to war. And what we saw happen was people started growing their own food and keeping their own chickens and mending their own clothes, right? Sort of things that they would have, we now use the word outsourced, right, to other people through the division of labor, they were now bringing back into the household. And that was a reduction in the division of labor, reduction in specialization, and a reduction in productivity, right? I mean, people were much worse off having to spend their time doing things that they weren't very good at because they couldn't afford, there weren't enough people to do the kinds of, to create the marketplace for those things, and resources were scarce. So yeah, we do see some reversing of that process.
Yeah, it's funny. Intuitively, I think when somebody makes all their own clothes and does all this stuff for themselves, they seem so rugged, or it's self-sufficiency has such a great connotation outside of economics, but really it's, we would think self-sufficiency is basically poverty.
Right. And there's a deep irony to that, right? Which is the critics of economics, and especially the critics of sort of economists who like free markets, is often that we view human beings as atomistic and detached and sort of, self-sufficient and individual, right? All those they see those as pejoratives, right? But the reality is that no, we don't at all, right? Human beings are not especially, certainly are not full of all these skills or anything, right? What economists recognize is that in fact, what the market does is not divide us, not atomize us, but it enables us to cooperate with each other for precisely the reasons we're talking about, right? That we're completely dependent in the marketplace on other people for all the necessities of life. We can't do it all on our own. And if we try to do it all by ourselves, we're going to live much worse than we would otherwise. So yeah, I mean, I want to look at my sort of lefty friends who raise these criticisms, who are wearing clothes made from around the world and off to, eat Korean food, right? Like, this is the market, right? The market's made you utterly dependent upon these people all across the world to cooperate, to provide you with the things you like.
Yeah, so guess one potential objection might be to say, like, sure, the average human has a big positive impact on the world around them and on other humans, but maybe the marginal human has a much smaller impact. So if we reduce the human population by one, say, one fewer baby is born, even if that baby would have been a doctor, he would only have contributed, his contribution as a doctor would have just been, the marginal medical procedure. So maybe removing a benign cyst or something, but not life-saving surgery. The other doctors would have still handled that. So what would you say to that sort of argument? The marginal person has a lower value potentially than the average person.
Well, look, I mean, two kinds of response. One, the obvious one is, how do you know which one's which, right? I mean, if my wife and I are considering, having a kid, are we supposed to somehow know that my kid's going to be the marginal kid or not, right? How do we know? So that seems, I'm going to take it, making a reductio ad absurdum here, right? I mean, if critics really believe that, that's a case for get kids, wait till kids are 18, decide who's productive and who's not, and kill off the ones who aren't, right? I mean, if we're so utilitarian, it sounds like Peter Singer now. So yeah, but again, I don't think that's what the critics are saying. I think there is a more reasonable position there. And I think the answer to that is to recognize even people who aren't brilliant or aren't especially productive in an absolute sense still make everyone else better off by specializing in the thing that they do relatively best. In economics, the theory of, that whole story of specialization and exchange is based upon the idea of comparative advantage. Even if, let's say, my wife can cook dinner better than I can and clean the dishes faster than I can, it doesn't make sense for her to do both and me to do nothing. It makes sense for me to do the thing I do relatively best, even if she does both absolutely best. And we sort of extend that out society-wide, right? There's always somewhere someone can do something at the least cost, right? And they can contribute to human well-being by doing that thing. They don't have to be a great doctor who cures cancer. They don't even have to be a mediocre doctor, even if they're, something more, even if they're a trash collector, right? If they're good at it and that's what they do and they do well, great, you've contributed, right? And the more people we have, the more precisely we can figure out what it is that people do best and how they can contribute.
So another way to make this argument is in terms of externalities. The Rieder argument seems to be that there's a lot of internalized benefit. When you have kids, you get the joy of raising the kid and all this, but then there's externalized costs on the rest of society. But it seems that you and people like Julian Simon have been arguing that it's really the other way around. There's a lot of internalized costs to having a child, and then there's externalized benefits.
Yeah, I think that, right. I think that's, again, this is where we get into this whole question of, sort of the role of public policy and so on, right? Because no doubt, all right, if you have kids and they're, some of the medical costs might be socialized onto other people, and we think about various welfare programs, it's certainly possible that part of the cost of raising your kid, public schools, for example, are borne by other people. But it's still overwhelmingly the case, and certainly in the developed world, I think the kinds of people that Rieder was talking to, right, that the majority of the costs of having a child are on the parents themselves, right? I mean, the parents have to feed and clothe the kid. The parents put them through school. Parents have to provide all other kinds of things for them, right? So again, it's, there's no question that the majority of the costs, though not all, the majority of the costs for most people are borne by the parents themselves. And again, if the story we've been telling for the last half hour or so is right, many of the benefits of having kids spill over to society. Not all of them, right? I mean, the awesome thing about kids, and I have two of my own, and I'm marrying into two more. The awesome things about kids is that they really are. There are, as Brian Kaplan says, selfish reasons to have more kids. Kids are great, and they provide immense benefits for parents, but they also provide spillover benefits to the rest of society in just the ways that we've been talking about.
So one way that people have interpreted your argument is that more people means more Einsteins or more Elon Musks, and then those people invent things. But you don't like that interpretation, and you wrote a follow-up piece titled "Progress Does Not Depend on Geniuses." So what's wrong with focusing on the Einsteins?
I mean, it's, again, it's not wrong, okay? Because it is, more people does mean, in fact, that there is a greater possibility of producing, a genius or whatever. But I don't think that's the real argument. The real argument goes back to where we were a little while ago, which is more people means more hands to do all kinds of things, whether it's more people to pick your occupation, more teachers, more trash collectors, more web designers, whatever it might be. Right, more people means we have more human beings to produce. We can divide up that labor more finely. We have a bigger, extent of the market demanding things. So it just doesn't have to be genius. It's human beings are productive, and we produce more than we consume, and we add to the division of labor. We add to that social cooperation, and we deepen it. That comes from specializing in trading. So yeah, I think it's not it's not wrong to point out that more people means more geniuses. It's just not the best argument.
So one critique I've heard of this whole line of reasoning is that it's too human-centric. So what if you take into account the costs and the benefits on, if not Gaia, if on maybe the other life forms inhabiting Earth or just sort of the environment more generally?
Yeah, so I think this is more complicated, right? For two reasons. One, determining what those costs might be is a complicated question, there's both scientific and social scientific issues there, but there's an ethical and a values question too here, right? I mean, should we, if we want to say, it's anthropocentric, one of my responses to that is yay, right? I mean, I do think my own ethical view, and people can disagree with me, is that humans should and do count more, right? That we should care more about the human impact than these, than the other kinds of things. Now, obviously, if we're so damaging the environment that human beings can't live, then that matters by my own argument. So I think one of the questions to talk about here is, what is the extent of this damage, and what do we mean by damage when we talk about the environment, right? I was on Facebook or somewhere yesterday, someone was linked this thing about the Antarctica, the ice shelf in Antarctica shifting or cracking or something. And the comment was, human beings seem to be under the impression that once we came along, the Earth had to never change, right? The planet has been changing and evolving in ways that have happened regardless of human impact. Whether human impact has sped some things up, I think, is a legit question, and it probably has. But at the same time, go back to our earlier conversation, human beings are capable of solving our own problems, right? I mean, again, we human beings could have been like animals in that we reproduced and we ate up all the resources and we could only, stabilize our population through death. But we figured out how to evolve good social institutions that enable us to prevent that from happening by using resources more effectively, trading, and so on. And so markets and capitalism have enabled us to fight off that natural scarcity and make the planet more habitable, even as the planet itself is perhaps changing in all kinds of ways. So I do think human beings count more. I think there's also ways, if we're concerned about animals, a couple points I'd raise there. One, I think as human beings get wealthier, which we have, we are more interested in and have more resources with which to protect animals. So if you really care about animals, right, you want to make sure that we are wealthy enough, we have enough resources as a society that we're willing to devote attention to that. Right, we live in North America, right? We live in this place where you can get doggy acupuncture, right? That's nuts, right? It's great that we're so wealthy that people can afford acupuncture for their dogs, but go to the rest of the world, right? That's ridiculous to them, right? Because they can't care about their pets and their animals to the same degree. They have to take care of themselves first. So if we really want to care more about animals and care more about the environment in general, one of the empirical results we know is that as countries get wealthier, they spend more on keeping the environment clean. They in essence buy more of the good we call a clean environment. You can say the same thing about animals too. So if that's the case, and looping back, right, having more people makes us more productive, creates more wealth, it gives us the wealth we need to make sure that any damage that people do to the other creatures or the planet is minimized, because we can afford to take the steps to do so.
Yeah, one other way of putting this same point, I think, is that sometimes human interests are in opposition to animal or nature or some other group's interests, but sometimes they're aligned. So yeah, we're obviously opposed with the the mountain lion who's hanging around the playground. That's things are not going to end well for that mountain lion. But if somebody's working to develop ways to get more food out of less acres of farmland, then that's good for the animals who would live in the wilderness that is freed up by that.
Right, exactly. Just as one empirical example, in the United States, there's more forest in the United States and the forest coverage in the United States right now than there was 100 years ago, because we figured out ways where we didn't need to cut down trees to make houses and heat them. Right. So, the better that we use resources and the more efficiently, for example, we can grow food on land, the more wild land there is open. Right. And tourism does this, and we can think about market mechanisms to protect endangered species. There's all kinds of ways, right, that we can value non-human creatures and that having more wealth enables us to do so more effectively.
Do you have any closing thoughts on this issue?
Other than to say, I think the most important thing whenever we talk about environmental issues is this issue of trade-offs, right? Is recognizing, two things. One, the idea that humans are not just consumers, but producers. But the trade-off notion, right? The optimal quantity of anything is rarely zero. And that whatever we want to do to improve the environment, to improve the planet, to fight off global warming, climate change, will have costs to it. And we have to think seriously about those trade-offs. What are we willing to pay or do to get the outcome that we think is ideal? I think that's the question we always need to ask.
My guest today has been Steve Horwitz. Steve, thanks for being part of Economics Detective Radio.
My pleasure, Garrett. Thanks for having me.
If you want to know more about this topic, head on over to economicsdetective.com/population. I had to think about it a long time, what I was going to call the show notes page. I always try to pick out the main theme and make a short link. In past episodes, that's been easy, but we dealt with so many issues. Having children and climate change and is having children a net help or a net harm? And it's hard to sum that up in one word. You can't just say children, and you can't just say climate, and you can't just say environment. But economicsdetective.com/population, because what we're ultimately debating is, should the population be bigger or smaller? And it all comes down to that.